Okay, so I tried to put a whole lot of material in 4 slides. So I'm going to step through it fairly quickly. There's a lot of thinking behind it, obviously, and I'm happy to answer any questions. But in just 10 minutes or thereabouts, we're not going to get into a lot of detail, and so I'm using 1 or 2 representative examples as analogous to a larger picture. Most of you, I hopefully, are familiar with some of the materials we're talking about. You've probably seen variations of this, and it has to do with the trend lines of U.S. defense budgets. We took about a 10-year slice to look at it. If you notice, we're about a 3.6 or so average percentage of GDP. If you were to look at a much larger slice since, say, World War II, it's actually up around 5.5% or thereabouts. So the last decade's pretty interesting. You can see where 9/11 occurred, and then each of the fiscal years that go out from that. A lot of OCO, Overseas Contingency Operations funding, was built into the budget above the baseline. But you can see how it relates. And then in the last few years, the last 4 or so, we've had this fairly precipitous decline. Part of it understandable. If you're in Iraq and you're in Afghanistan and you get out, you got less spending in those areas. However, what's hidden in all of this is the fact that the costs of the military, whether it's the tank or the ship or the plane that you buy, or the pay and benefits for military personnel or whatever, those have increased, and the baseline has not increased accordingly. So you could spend defense dollars on the immediacy of expending bullets and fuel and replacing combat losses, and that accounts for this plus-up, but you're not really addressing the long-term health and viability of your baseline military force. So keep that in mind then as we go through. This next one is kind of a view from 2011, which is a pretty good representation of the high point of U.S. Military capabilities. And we've tried to account for things in the way that the services look at themselves. If the Navy looks at it at ship count, the Army's going to look at it brigade combat teams, the Marine Corps looks at it in terms of battalions and end strength. So you can see these highs for the Marine Corps, 27 battalions, 202,000 Marines, the Army at the other end, 48 brigade combat teams was their objective. Currently, that second column there, you see where we're at. The Navy tends to hold pretty stable because once you built a ship, it's going to be around for a long, long time. And there is kind of a planned cycle of retiring a ship, decommissioning it, and replacing it with another one. But as you look out to shipbuilding accounts in the out years, it gets pretty dire. Another kind of hidden factor is when somebody changes how they count things, the Navy being a good example, how I account for my battle force. They're no longer counting some types of ships, but they're including others. So when you count a hospital ship as part of your ship count, I don't really see that as combat power that you're projecting into somebody else's theater. So the numbers get really, really screwy. You'll see in a next slide or two where I credit the Navy with a certain number of ships, and what I've done is saying I'm not going to give you credit for your hospital ships, and I'm also not going to give you credit for ships that you're actually putting in long-term storage, in a sense, but you're still counting as part of your battle force. So if I take 11 of my 22 cruisers and I put them in long-term layup, they're really not usable if I have to go to war immediately. So I detract that, getting rid of all their frigates here this next year. So some of these numbers, there's a story behind it. But this is indicative, at the FY19, if sequestration levels of funding actually stay, and we think they probably will, which is, in my view, a very bad idea, you're going to see an Army at 420,000 and half the strength in brigade combat teams than they were just a couple of years ago. Half the strength. And if you read any of the testimony from any of the service chiefs about readiness, 20% of your units get underway or deploy out. X number of squadrons are no longer able to fly. It's a fairly dire picture. But this is the kind of thing that we're looking at here in the out years. It's basically a U.S. military that's about half of what it was just a few years ago. George?
When you talk about ships, one of my concerns is we're retiring the Navy frigates.
Right.
We're bringing on more LCS.
Correct.
There's no way that the LCS is equivalent.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in terms of your ship counts, the Navy basically saying I retire 50 frigates, I'm going to replace it with 50 LCSs. That counts against that same number.
Right. So what I find interesting is in these kinds of discussions, in my view, anything from like FY16 on is lies, obfuscation, magic, fairy dusting. It's really hard to know what the future holds when you have something like the littoral combat ship, and it was supposed to be low cost, be able to go in fairly congested waters, so shallow draft, relatively speaking. It would have these various modulars, that you would reconfigure it based on the mission. Completely ignoring the fact that it's going to be double the cost of what you thought it was going to be. No funding applied to actual modules. The expectation that your crew is going to be able to do all sorts of missions at equal levels of proficiency, in that, right? And so it's up for debate. Do I have a small ship flotilla kind of concept, or do I have a deep water Navy with deep draft vessels and lots of long-range shooters? So those kinds of debates do occur similarly in the other services, but it is an analogous situation. So the Navy's got to figure that out. It is true that their frigates were getting old and long in the tooth, but since you've committed to a certain number of littoral combat ships, where is the funding for a direct replacement of a frigate or a small destroyer, kind of platform? And they haven't really solved that problem. But this is the direction that we're heading. It's probably Chinese made. There we go. And so what I want to talk about now is the actual budget. People will talk about the U.S. spends X amount of dollars, compared to the next 15 nations combined, and 10 of those are allies and all that kind of good stuff, right? Which is a completely flawed comparison. Because when we talk about the budget, it's not all deployable power projection, combat power kinds of stuff. You've got bases and facilities, the infrastructure that has to be maintained. You have salaries and benefits, that change over time. That doesn't translate into bullets or missiles. You have all kinds of developmental programs that are going on, which are absolutely necessary, but it's not combat power that's immediately applicable in the field, right? So what we did here was we took the current FY15 budget proposal and we started graying out things that either can't be changed just because of the nature of what they are. For instance, if Congress doesn't allow DOD to close bases, you have to continue to fund the maintenance and infrastructure, care and keeping of those bases. And then there are things that the services have been told that they cannot change at all. So you try to, if you're a service chief and you bring up any proposal for reducing in any way the rate of growth of salaries or the out-of-pocket cost for a service member for health care or something like that, it runs into a buzzsaw of opposition. And I'm not here to debate the merits one way or the other. I'm just saying that these are restrictions placed on the services. So the first thing we look at is actual manpower costs. Right now, Congress has no appetite for allowing the services or the defense establishment to change those at all. So you kind of take those off the table. Then you look at infrastructure costs, various types of procurement that aren't related to combat power. We spend a lot of money on Skillcraft pens, admin supplies, toilet. I mean, there's all this stuff, that goes to making a military town run and those kinds of things, but it's not necessarily combat power. So really what we have is a little bit less than half of the military budget is actually related to combat capabilities with which you would deal with the world, right? Any kind of threat environment where you might want to go. And if you look at this, the vast majority is here in the O&M piece, your operations and maintenance. So repair parts, supplies, ammunition that I expend and I have to buy new. At the top part is the procurement piece. I have a combat loss. I need to replace a tank or a Humvee that's been destroyed, or plan multi-year modernization kinds of things. And then look at that big chunk on R&D. So you really need to be investing in what's the next generation X, bomber, ship, JLTV. I mean, these kinds of things that are accounted for in that budget as well. So we're giving credit to those R&D accounts and procurement in terms of combat power, but you can kind of think through, is that immediately applicable to a battlefield or intervening in some kind of a crisis somewhere in the world? So when we think about the U.S. defense budget, there's only a piece of it that's relevant to securing national interests on any given day or week or in the very near future. So what I wanted to do then is tee up one example, and we'll just use the Navy because it's easier to count ships than it is Air Force squadrons that can move around a lot more readily. So when we think about Navy ships, right now what they've said is the desired quantity is 313 ships. All different types, but it's about 313. Now privately the Navy will say we'd actually like 450 or 380, but they realize 350 is the right number. We have that from the experts. So, but it's much more than 313. Right now, the SCN account, their objective for that, the plan is 306, if I've got my math right. What they're funded for is really about 265. So a paper that just came out from Deputy Secretary Work, I believe, and his group, was talking about the need to fund shipbuilding at the $18 to $20 billion a year level. And I think current funding is about the $13 or $14 billion a year level. So they're just not going to get to the stage that they want to be. So my point here is that numbers really do matter in terms of fieldable, deployable capabilities. Now, when you look at the history of Navy deployment cycles and what's where, it's usually about a quarter to maybe a third of the fleet that is operationally available and deployed out in somebody's ocean. So if you look at the latest budget slide from the Navy, they'd say 104 ships out of 287, I think, or something like that. I think it's artificially high because they're deferring maintenance and yard work because the demand for these platforms is so great, right? But if you look at historical norm, it's about 20, 25, maybe 30%. So what I've said is that a 265 ship count, you've got 70 or 80 that would be available. Those 70 or 80 then are not all in one place. They're distributed around the world. So roughly half of them you would find on duty in the Pacific, Western Pacific, about equal numbers, maybe a quarter, well, less than a quarter each in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean Gulf area, and then just a couple in the Caribbean or in the Atlantic proper. I would have made those slices smaller, but then you wouldn't be able to read the text, so it's not quite there. So when we think about that, let's just think about what would be in the Pacific, and at the 70 or 80 ship availability level, let's say 35 of them or something are on routine duty in the Pacific, and if something came up with China, China has 470 ships in their Navy. So what the U.S. likes to do is play an away game, and our away games are like 8,000 miles from home. It takes 3 weeks to sail across the Pacific, right? So the forward deployed force we would have is playing in somebody else's neighborhood where they're playing the home game. So they have immediate access to ports and facilities, shore-based kinds of capabilities to cover their fleet in that area. And we're having to sail for long periods of time, fairly far, even if you have access to somebody else's port.
Most of those 470 ships have less capability than our LCS.
Well, they do, absolutely. I take that, but they can also be used as spotters, as intelligence collection. If you're out there and you're radiating, our fleet has to account for that. Even to neutralize it as a concern, it still detracts from my ability to focus on what I want to do. So I completely buy it that a lot of them are Coast Guard kinds of things, but it is a number, and where you can put an anti-ship cruise missile on a very uncapable ship, the cruise missile itself can range 50, 80, 100 nautical miles, and it's something that the U.S. Navy would have to account for. I think it's a fair argument to make. So as I just talked about, you've got the naval, maritime stuff, and you got all this shore-based stuff as well. So the PLA Navy, the PLAN, their air components, about 350 aircraft, varying levels of generations, but they are platforms from which you could launch bombs, air-launched cruise missiles, et cetera. It could be spotters, surveillance platforms. The PLA Air Force, about 1,600 aircraft, both bombers and fighters, and those are being improved as we speak. So roughly 2,000 aircraft, shore-based anti-ship cruise missiles in the low thousands, and the short-range and medium-range ballistic missiles, 2,000 plus. The reason those are important is those can range any port, base, airfield that we might be operating from in the region. So it's a complicating factor when you want to play an away game in somebody else's neighborhood. What are you bringing to the fight, and what is it going up against? So if you look at the left column, how much are we spending on defense? We have to keep in mind that what we do spend on defense is then dispersed and distributed globally. and you only have small pieces that are actually usable as combat power to take care of a particular emerging crisis. So just to continue with the example, we've got 11 carriers. If you had half of them, for instance, dedicated to one theater at about 60 or 70 aircraft per deck, some of those are surveillance, some of them are strike platforms, but we're giving them credit. It's about 300 aircraft that we could forward deploy. I'm not discounting the fact that we'd have land-based air as well, but in this kind of naval environment comparison, it's something to think about. So when you look at overall numbers, we're actually working at about a 1 to 10 ratio. So if we think that we have a technological superiority, I hope that our stuff is 10 times as good as the enemy's, because in battle, I'm telling you from experience, quantity really matters when you're in an attrition fight. So when we lose a thing, it's a greater percentage of our aggregate combat power than somebody else that has greater numbers of something. So in warfare, numbers really do matter. And to the extent that we underfund kinds of programs and things, we really hobble our force. So this next slide then has to do with a world map, and it was interesting to hear A World in Flames. That was actually the title that I picked for the slide, and I changed it, like Robert Kagan's talk, a discussion about world unraveling. But this is kind of a global map. And what I did was I highlighted some of the major actors that are bad guys, China, problems we've been having with Iran, Iraq, up in Afghanistan, Syria, etc. Russia's been meddlesome, obviously, in Ukraine, seizing the Crimea. North Korea has been launching various missiles. That's right, but I do have on this next slide all the bad guys. And I chose a bunch of skulls because there's just some evil out there in the world. So we've got drug traffickers, human trafficking. You've got the highest amount of cocaine production that currently occurs in Peru. You've got the tri-border area where all kinds of nastiness comes out to. Nigeria itself, everybody's familiar with Boko Haram and Muslim versus Christian fighting. The sub-Saharan Africa, a lot of militant Islamists that are running around. So the world is just really a messy place, and this is what really we're having to deal with. But we're not alone, we've got allies, right? I didn't highlight Canada just because I got tired of my PowerPoint skills and didn't want to paint the line around, but we've got a lot of friends in the region, but this is the problem. Serial underinvestment in not only their own defensive capabilities, but exportable or power projection kinds of capabilities. It is a world-class effort for somebody like Greece or Italy or even Great Britain these days to deploy a battalion, much less a brigade. They just don't do out-of-area operations very much. The NATO target is 2% of GDP. For many, many years, it's been much, much less than that. I think there are 4 NATO members that are actually at 2% or above. Most of them are down in the low ones. It gives an average about 1.5%. Korea is doing pretty well. Obviously not NATO, but it's a sample. Japan, 1% of GDP. They're trying to normalize. They're trying to deal with a rising China as America recedes and withdraws from these regions, and you've seen the decline in our actual capabilities. America, again, 3.5% in 2013, roughly 4% or so I mentioned over the past decade. But if you think you're going to be relying on allies and friends for enabling capabilities, you don't want to be betting the security of our country and interests on the efforts of others. It's just the way the world is. So when we look at the United States, the vast majority of our stuff is retained back home, right? 90% of Army Brigade combat teams, you only got 3 that are out there in the world of the 35 or so that are available. Most of the ships, two-thirds of Marine Corps battalions, and the vast majority of Air Force fighter and bomber wings. So most of our stuff is at home. The world is a nasty place and it's out there and we have very little forward. So my closing item here then is that the Defense Department and the services are very constrained in what they can do to handle or absorb these budget cuts. All the proposals that they've submitted that I'm aware of that have gone to Congress have been serially rejected. No, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other thing, and oh, by the way, you must do these other things that we haven't funded you for. So when it comes to the services, and they look at the basket of money that's been actually provided to them to run their services in a given fiscal year, because of these restrictions, they have to go to reducing manpower, because I can't reduce the cost of the manpower, so I just get rid of people, which is salaries. I cancel and delay modernization programs. I delay maintenance, and the Navy is would tell you to your eyes water how much maintenance they've actually delayed. I reduced training. So if it costs me gasoline, diesel fuel, if it costs me rounds expended on a range, those monies I want to save so my people don't get as much training as they should have. I don't fly my... Social welfare programs, there we go. So all these things then lead to reduced readiness. So the result for the military is a smaller military, it's less modernized in a world where everybody else, bad guys, Russia, China, others are modernizing theirs, and it's less ready to deal with the world. The consequence is, I believe, greatly increased risk to national security interests and certainly to our forces as they engage around the world. So that's it. And I think that this is actually a rosy picture. People I talk with, Frank Hoffman and some others, feel that sequestration level is not the floor, it's actually the ceiling. And I think the numbers that I showed up on the screen will actually be less when you get to 18, 19 and out. So it's a pretty dire picture.
Dakota, thank you. That was superb. Don't go away. We're going to ask you some questions. Let me just start off, if I may. One of the things that we always hear, and you addressed it very nicely, I think, is this idea that we're spending so much more than everybody else. And I'm often reminded, we're not the world's policemen, to be sure. But on the other hand, nobody in their right mind would say that the police have to be spending approximately the same amount as the criminals. And the truth of the matter is, that's kind of the model that people who are Larry Korb and these other characters are essentially advocating, is that there has to be some sort of equivalence between those who are trying to maintain the peace and those that are trying to destroy it. One thing that this is a superb short course on the problem, and I think the fact that you've got it down to 4 slides, more or less, is really a testament to both your skill and the important way you're thinking about this. But I was particularly struck by the last, next to the last, I guess it was, item, which is something that I hadn't really appreciated, is the amount, or the percentage of the assets we have for actual combat that are CONUS-based. And I just can't help myself but to point out that one of the things that has really struck me as we've been working on this problem of the vulnerability of our electric grid is that 99% of the bases on which those assets reside depend upon the grid. And if the grid actually is taken out, they're not going to the fight, or at least not as quickly as you probably think they will, which is a further reason to be concerned that enemies of this country have figured out that if they do want to do mischief in the world, especially given the relatively few number of assets we have forward deployed, that's a way to keep the reinforcements from coming at them. And I don't know if you have any comments on that or not,
Well,
but it's another piece of the strategic condition we're in.
Absolutely. Cyber is one area where you talk about SCADA-level systems and the ability to manipulate power grids, hydroelectric plants, those kinds of things. I had a big skull and crossbones on China. They're legendary in terms of their cyber warfare capabilities. The Russians do as well, although they contract that out as opposed to an official organization. And there are other players in the world too. So the vulnerability of essentially the open architecture and critical infrastructure upon which government, military, federal law enforcement, local communities all depend is inherently vulnerable. That vulnerability becomes more complex because the government doesn't control all that. It's in the hands of private companies, and there has to be some discussion, and I know there is ongoing, as to the extent to which the private sector bears the burden of hardening or protecting or providing increased resiliency. Several very good reports out of committees in Congress have looked at this, but nobody is taking action on it. So that's one part. The second part is you're aware of the string of presumably test runs against power distribution facilities, where somebody has taken shots at transformer stations. One theory is they're measuring what the response time is of local authorities to show up, or what the impact might be on a local community at the loss of a major transformer capability or power distribution center. So there is constant probing both in the cyber and the physical realm Our critical infrastructure is very well known and understood. Much of it is accessible, at least in terms of understanding on the web, and it is intimately related and linked to our ability to not only defend our own borders, but to defend our interests. And to your point that Victor Davis Hanson and Kagan and some others have really talked about is there's an existing world order of trade, of the exchange of ideas, of stable governments that change hands without, violent overthrow and all. And that has really been both underwritten and secured by the dominance of America as really a force for good in so many ways. Nobody's perfect, but it's good. And to the extent that we lose the ability to do that, you'll see continued upheaval coming even to our shores.
Yeah, Pax Americana, I think it's been called. Just on the, if I may, the first point, I saw in Bill Gertz's column this week that the United States has begun a collaborative effort with the Chinese on smart grid technology. So if you think we've got problems with the exposure to the critical infrastructure now, just wait till they're inside that wire.
Question the use of the word smart.
Indeed. Admiral, did you have a question? Yeah. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
The problem is where to start. The LCS program was a failed experiment from the beginning. It should have been canceled. It never happened. Our aircraft squadrons are only about 80% effective in composition and overall than we were years ago. So, when you put the numbers up, there's a shallowness in there that's not reflected. The other key element here is the readiness and capability of our forces and how it is being down in a downward slope with the multiplication of the social welfare programs and forcing women into combat roles. All of this does not enhance readiness. The restricted rules of engagement that were forced on our people. This all has to have a tremendous impact on morale and leading up to where are we and how it's impacting on our ability to retain the type of people we actually need to keep.
Yeah, I would say that at least my colleagues, myself, I will always focused on mission accomplishment. So what is the military task to be accomplished? And I work back from that. So any additional factor that's introduced, if it isn't directed at the proficiency and the effectiveness of the combat force to accomplish an assigned mission, I have to question why that factor was introduced. If it's for promotion and advancement in terms of an equal opportunity kind of thing, that would seem to me it's more of a personal benefit type bit, and it's not necessarily focused on the combat effectiveness of that force. If a weapon system is being procured because its production has been distributed across 48 or 45 of the 50 states, and everybody's now concerned about jobs rather than whether the platform is effective in combat, F-35, lower payload and shorter range, even though the avionics suite is supposedly awesome. Again, I go to numbers, cost per platform, and what am I getting? So there are all these kinds of examples of policy decisions being implemented or enforced onto the military, which, because it's a great military, it salutes smartly and says we'll do our best to implement it, but it doesn't seem to be accounting for the ugly realities of the world. If you get into a knife fight with somebody, it takes some strength, it takes some heft, it takes some mentality to be able to engage in that, and not everything can be handled at range with a smart missile.
Well, there's one thing, you don't just...
There's
one thing, you just
going.
don't salute smartly. You took an oath to protect and defend this great country of ours, and what they've done, for the most part, disgustingly, is sold their souls. And I'm talking about our military leadership.
Yeah, and I know what you're talking about, and I just had a conversation with this morning about this very topic, and that there is a debate at the general officer, flag officer level about what does it mean to obey a lawful order. So if the order is lawful, whether it's wise or foolish, it then brings up this question of a serving military officer, does he carry out the order or does he resign? If he puts the stars on the table and resigns because he just morally, ethically cannot condone this policy, so goes this argument, is that in effect, because of his position, undermining civilian control and authority over the military. So I know we're not going to resolve that here. I'm just articulating the sides of the argument. So I'm in your camp, and I know that there is great consternation within the military services to see some of the policy decisions that have been embraced by senior leadership. But I know it's debated. Right.
I mean, they bought off on it.
Sure.
Look, it really seems to me that if a general officer or flag officer resigns his commission, that doesn't speak to their willingness to be subordinate to the civilian military, civilian authorities. That simply is an expression of the profound concern of those military officers. And the point is that it creates conditions for corrective action by the civilian government that, in the absence of it, is likely to continue to plunge down this road. Dan?
Thank you for a really interesting presentation. Just my 2 cents in the last argument. I'm a former submarine officer, only for a few years, and if you're a Marine officer, I just don't see the lobotomy scar. I'm not sure where that is. My 2 cents on the last thing is,
I had somebody else make the slides for me.
other than Admiral Lyons, I'm not sure how many of the serving admirals are of the same mindset. I think that a lot of the type of person that's promoted is as much of a politician as the people in the Senate, with due respect to them. So that might be the issue, the type of person that we've been selecting for the higher ranks in this day and age. But moving on to I really thank you for this presentation. I'm familiar with this area, but the actual numbers are really instructive. It brings up for me another question. When we look at the slide about China, even if we had our dream scenarios, the numbers would still be ridiculous, relatively speaking. I mean, if we double the number of ships in the Pacific Fleet, hypothetically, we still end up with the same type of disparity. And it speaks to another issue, which is probably outside the scope of your talk, which is our strategy as a country needs to be updated for the world we're in today. We probably shouldn't be sending either 35 or 70 ships to deal with China unless we have an idea of what they're going to do in a crisis.
Yeah, and I can tell you the naval services in particular have been looking at that. If you've even given a glance to Expeditionary Force 21, EF-21, which is the Marine Corps document out, they're talking about advanced base operations, distributed operations. You know, as a Marine, hopefully the same thing in the other services, you never look at your enemy as unbeatable. Everybody's got flaws and weaknesses. So the thing is, how do you complicate his problem? So if I can approach him multi-axis, if I can force him to try to look and defend everywhere and thin out his defenses, with me knowing where I want to go, what are the critical targets that I'm actually going at, use a lot of subterfuge, you know, use deception, movements in one place, you know, to mask movements someplace else. So there are ways to array your forces and the types of activities that you conduct. And it wouldn't be just the ships, obviously. You'd be doing our own cyber, you know, offensive things. You'd be doing special operations, you know, types of things. You'd be conducting attacks on their critical infrastructure if it came to that level, right? If it came to that level, the other actors in the region, would they view it better to side with the United States or put in, you know, league with China? So you might have more actors in play. So this is a very simplistic picture, but it is to illustrate that numbers really do matter. Yep. But I didn't want to get into saying that we wouldn't develop battle plans or operational concepts, which are in development, to try to deal with the complexity of that theater. It could be that a containment kind of strategy, and you just essentially starve them into submission. You know, they're critically dependent on oil from the Middle East. We can set astride those sea lines of communication. The arable land is disappearing with increasing desertification, you know, sandstorms blowing through Beijing. So they're dependent more and more on the external world. And with us operating on exterior lines, if you think about it in the military context, there are things that we can do to China that they can't do to us. So it's not a completely one-sided game. I'm just saying that at reduced numbers, it makes the problem all the harder. And we should think seriously about having more capabilities and more options than willfully reducing our capabilities and making the problem more difficult than it needs to be.
We'll do one more question, then we got to move on. I just wanted to add in the meantime that the other complication is, of course, something you alluded to but didn't get into, is if that qualitative edge is disappearing, then these numbers are even more bleak.
Yeah, the 1 to 10 ratio becomes even problematic.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Dakota, I was at a breakfast earlier in the week with Admiral Greenert, and it reminded me of something that the current PACAF commander, Hawk Carlisle, was asked a few years ago when he was the A3, and somebody said, are we going to be going to war against China? And he paused and said, probably not, but we're going to find ourselves up against the weapons that they're developing, and they're going to be proliferating. And Admiral Greenert made the same remark about who would have thought that Hezbollah would have had a missile in the back of a pickup truck that almost sunk a state-of-the-art Israeli patrol boat out there. And increasingly, we're going to find ourselves anywhere we operate around the world, we're going to be up against those kinds of technology. Right now, in the Marine Corps' new, what is it, Expeditionary War 2021, now saying the ARG is going to have to stand a minimum of 76 miles off the coast.
So in the 1930s, the Spanish Civil War served as a great testing cauldron for technologies that then we saw coming into fruition in World War II. So the Germans were there, the Italians, the British, the Americans, all testing out various tanks and dive bombing tactics and all that stuff. Bad day for the Spanish, but the Western side learned a lot of things from it. So you could look at the 2006 Second Lebanon War, where Israel went up against Hezbollah in southern Lebanon and saw these precision munitions, thermal optics, night vision gear, proprietary covered fiber optic communications, on and on and on. That was in 2006. They roll forward to today, explosively formed penetrators, which is an advanced, roadside bomb kind of capability, capable of taking out an M1 tank, RPG 29s and 31s. I mean, some very sophisticated kinds of things that are out there, which gives a single person precision, accuracy at range. So instead of volume fire, right now each bullet finds its mark. So it's a dramatically different world. I think the correlation of forces changes, that instead of tank versus tank, it's tank versus anti-tank munition. And it's a lot cheaper to produce a lot of high-end guided munitions than it is the platform that those munitions are used against. So then you get into inventories, and if I've got a few numbers of ships, even though they're capable and they have VLS cells, how many ballistic missiles, how many medium-range missiles, how many cruise missiles can my opponent? So throughout the Cold War, we were up against the Soviet Union. We never went into a large-scale actual military conflict on the inter-German border, but you had to have the capacity and the capability to push up against them. Otherwise, they were going to overwhelm you. And I think the direction we're heading is we might not, obviously we don't want to go to war with China, hopefully we never do, but if you can't contest space and you just cede that region to them, people or other countries in that region will have no choice but to align with them out of their own self-interest. It's a bad day for the country, or our country, and I think it'd be a bad day for the world.
Amen. Dakota, I'm sorry we have to leave it at that, but thank you. Come back, please.